and then kick us off. Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 5 of our financial support group, Coping with COVID. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces, and I've been enjoying so much reading your emails and rereading the questions and the comments you keep adding. So thank you for those. Keep them coming because they make all this content so much more interesting than me just dreaming about things to talk about each week. I do have my chat box open, so if you have additional questions as we're going through this, definitely put them in the chat. And if you're recording this and watching it later, go ahead and just shoot me an email if you have additional questions, and we'll get to them next week. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Elaine, and I run a company called Minerva Financial Arts that helps artists and arts organizations with the business side of their creativity. And lately, that has meant a lot of webinars, a lot of podcast interviews, and a lot of one-on-one support around unemployment and the PPP program, and support for individuals who are trying to figure out how to make things work. It's definitely a tough time right now. But the industry is rallying, as the arts industry often does. I have the pleasure of working with incredible groups all around the country in normal times, and watching these groups step up and create resources and provide opportunities for artists and the arts industry overall has just been so wonderful and so gratifying. And I hope you as individual artists are feeling the big hug of support coming from those of us that are part of the industry and who love the industry. I know it's not easy right now, but I hope you're feeling the support and the momentum all around you. Per usual, this is educational information and not meant to be used as tax, legal, or accounting advice. Those of you who have been listening along for several weeks know that the rules are changing on a very regular basis, and it is really hard to stay on top of all the new guidance that's coming out. So what we said 5 weeks ago, the first time we did this, is no longer relevant, right? And so definitely make sure you are following the latest guidance and clarifying things when it makes sense to do so. Also, per usual, we're going to talk through a couple of relevant updates. There aren't too many this week, and then spend most of the time talking about some of the submitted questions that came in. There's some really, really wonderful ones, so I'm excited to be able to dive into them. The biggest update is, you probably heard last Thursday, the PPP program officially ran out of money. And this was not a surprise. It was probably underfunded to begin with. And when there is a scarcity of resources and a confusing process, lots of people are applying, and then the money ran out. I did hear anecdotal evidence that a couple of people still squeezed out approvals after the money officially ran out. But in general, it seems like everything has now fully been locked down. There has been discussion in Congress about appropriating an additional $300 million to fund this program. So if you were in line to apply for PPP and you were maybe still in the process of gathering your paperwork, go ahead and keep gathering it, because if additional funding is appropriated, the floodgates will open up again, and it'll be a really good idea to be ready to go with your financial institution partner. The PPP program is the payroll replacement kind of program. And for individual artists, what we learned in guidance released by the SBA last Tuesday was that individual artists who are thinking about applying for this program can borrow up to 2.5 times their average payroll amount. And so what that looks like is, according to the guidance, your Schedule C from your 2019 tax return. Now, some of you may not have filed your 2019 tax return yet. They are accepting sort of a pro forma version of Schedule C. So maybe it's not been filed yet, but if you've already gone ahead and filled it out, you have an idea of what your net income for the year may have been. They're looking at that line 31 number. That is your net income for the year. So all of your Schedule C income minus your ordinary and necessary business deductions, that gives you your line 31 amount. And what they're looking at is that number divided by 12 will give you your average monthly payroll amount. Now we know in the arts that things fluctuate and average isn't always indicative of what you may be losing during this period, but that's how the rules and the guidelines are written. So we're looking at that average monthly payroll amount, and then you can multiply that by 2.5 to figure out the maximum amount you can borrow under the PPP program. Now here's the kicker. If you spend the money that you borrow under the PPP program on replacing your own payroll, which remember we calculated as that average monthly payroll amount, if you spend 75% of that money on replacing your own payroll, and all the rest goes to your studio rent or studio mortgage interest payments or studio utilities, then the entire loan is forgiven, meaning you do not have to pay it back. So it still technically counts as a loan, but it works more like a grant as long as you provide the paperwork that shows that you spent the money on your own payroll or rent or utilities for your business. So this is a pretty good deal. And what we've been seeing is most individual artists are prioritizing this over unemployment because this essentially covers 2 months worth of payroll, which is a little bit easier than going through the unemployment process, especially since it varies so much state by state. There are other individuals who have done the math and figured out that unemployment is a better option for them. That's totally fine too. This is an either or choice, right? So if you do have PPP, you have to remain employed by yourself for that 2-month period, right? So you wouldn't be eligible for unemployment during that time. Although we're in sort of a weird situation now where you might find yourself applying for unemployment now, especially with no PPP money. But then if more is appropriated, then you can drop off unemployment and then start on PPP for the 8-week period beginning when you're approved. So lots of weird nuances going on, but the big takeaway is PPP is out of money, but there might be more money. So go ahead and get your 2019 Schedule C ready to go so that you know what amount you might want to apply for. And then the application form is super simple. It's like a 2-page PDF. It's on the SBA website. Really, really easy to fill out. And if you have it ready to go, if your financial institution opens up additional funding and if Congress approves additional funding, then you're ready to go ahead and get in line. There is a question in the chat, which is a wonderful one. Is there any credit rating penalty if you don't pay the PPP back because it qualifies as forgiven? Fantastic question. No, there is not. So if you borrow PPP money, it will show up as a loan, but then once you expend it on payroll and rent and utilities and all the things you're supposed to expend it on and show that to the bank, you basically get it as a loan and then you apply for it to be forgiven. So then once you apply for it to be forgiven, then when the bank says okay, then it will all be forgiven and there will be no negative impact on your credit. But while it's still a loan, it'll show up as a loan on your credit report if you are pulling that. The question again in the chat, is PPP retroactive in the same way unemployment is supposed to be? No, this is another sort of weird quirk about PPP. PPP starts on the day it's approved, and then you're supposed to receive funding within 10 days of that. So PPP won't necessarily look back, but your 2-month window to spend the funds on payroll mostly and other approved expenses starts on the day you get the money, which is why you can use unemployment for those couple weeks before it starts, but then you have to drop off of unemployment to rehire yourself, essentially. Another point in the chat, which is wonderful. Someone shared that PayPal has agreed to participate in the PPP program. PayPal actually was able to accept applications a little bit longer than some other banks, which is wonderful. Again, nobody has any money anymore, but if your financial institution isn't participating, but you have a PayPal account or you think about starting one, that could be a good option. I've also heard anecdotally that Square was thinking about participating as well. well. I haven't heard that that's been confirmed or not. But also anecdotally, what I've been hearing is that the smaller regional banks, the credit unions, they were actually able to respond much more nimbly than some of sort of the major financial institutions. So a lot of individuals had better luck with smaller regional, local, or credit union institutions rather than the biggest banks. And of course, now everything's on pause, so just kind of stay tuned. Here's another comment in the chat. This person's bank contacted them and there are 100,000 applicants ahead of you in line. Oh, Terry, I'm so sorry. That's a whole lot of applicants ahead of you in line. Should you be prepared to reapply through another source? You've heard that accountants have filed for PPP. Oh, that's really interesting. So there's a page on the Small Business Administration's website where you can find an SBA lender. It has kind of a map of the United States, and the link is buried within the PPP program description. What I would do is type in your zip code and look for some of the smaller providers that are in your area, and see if you can maybe reach out to them, see if their line might be a little bit shorter than 100,000. It's also possible that a lot of those applicants may be rejected for any number of reasons. We're not really sure. The program, as you know, it was rolled out really fast and there was some confusion. So I would still be prepared to get ready to go, because, if additional funding is approved and you do get in line, that sort of bolsters the argument that maybe more funding after that needs to be approved, just in case that's the case. Another question in the chat, could I give an example of paying myself payroll as a small proprietor LLC? Or will records of an internal bank transfer suffice for PPP loan forgiveness? Great question, Josh. So the payroll amount you're going to look to pay yourself is based on your 2019 Schedule C. So you take that line 31 number divided by 12. So that's going to be your average monthly payroll amount. And so when you are paying yourself that amount as part of PPP, what you're going to want to do is basically take that amount, transfer it to your personal bank account, and then that should be sufficient to document that that is the payroll you're giving yourself. It's not real payroll because you're not withholding taxes or anything like that. But based on the way the law is written, they're using last year's tax return as an approximation of your monthly payroll. So showing a transfer should be enough to get that qualified as a PPP transfer. It's a fantastic question. Yes, thank you for that. Okay, no more chat questions right now, but I'll keep an eye on it. So that's PPP, right? Delightful idea. We'll see how it goes. Maybe more money. The application is relatively simple, so go ahead and fill it out if you think it might make sense to do so, so you're ready to go if more money is approved. One other thought I do want to share on PPP though, even though you're allowed to borrow 2.5 times your average payroll amount, you don't have to borrow that much. I did a webinar last week and one of the artists shared that basically all their expenses are what they pay themselves and then their supplies, because they don't have studio rent, they don't have utilities, right? There aren't a whole lot of other expenses that would qualify for forgiveness. So as this person was doing the math, they realized they didn't want to borrow 2.5 times the average payroll amount. They just wanted to borrow 2 times average payroll so they could replace their payroll for 2 months and then not have any other expenses funded by PPP. That's okay. You do not have to borrow the maximum amount. You get to decide, and I would decide based on what's forgivable, what really makes sense for you. Okay, so that's PPP. The stimulus checks are going out. Several people last week had already started receiving them. I keep hearing more and more people are receiving them. And of course, more and more people are not, which is leading to questions. So the IRS updated this tool on its website maybe like 10 days ago now. I've lost track of the weeks. But this tool is called the Get My Payment tool. And you basically check the status of your stimulus payment. What a lot of people are finding is that as they check their own status following this link, something is going on. So maybe the information has been held up for some reason, or they're later in the queue. So what the IRS is suggesting is that this is often for people whose information may not be fully updated in the system. And then they'll answer questions about what you should do if your check is somehow lost somewhere. So if you haven't gotten your stimulus check payment yet, go ahead and do some investigating. And if the IRS needs additional information from you, go ahead and provide it. Last point, unemployment is sort of getting easier. More and more states are updating their systems and asking helpful questions and leaning on guidance for some of these other programs to help individual artists document their income. Having said that, this is still a really frustrating process for a lot of people. And so many individuals are getting rejected and realizing they're needing to reapply and confused that their status is still listed as pending, and just like it has been for several weeks. So I would encourage you just to keep being patient. I know it's insanely hard to do, but keep being patient, keep following up and checking if unemployment is a path you're pursuing. And then, as someone mentioned in the chat earlier, unemployment is retroactive. So it will eventually catch up and cover the missed weeks that you haven't gotten paid for yet, but it might take a minute to be able to do that. There was an article that came out through the AICPA, which of course is the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, that gave some advice on what to do with your stimulus money. If you were on the chat last week, you heard me answer one of the questioners who had received her check with basically this similar advice. My advice to her was, if you don't need it, just hang on to it, just save it. This particular person had a W-2 job that was continuing, which is wonderful. So if that's your case and you're receiving a stimulus payment, just hang on to it. If you're relying on it, as many people are, use it first to pay for any of your essential expenses. You know what these are for you and your household. In general, I'd prioritize food and medicine and other things that really are not optional, and ask for some flexibility with respect to any of the other payments that we would normally consider essential. Once those are covered, definitely think about saving this amount. You want it to be building up your emergency fund, because we're spending our emergency funds right now. So to the extent that you can replenish some of your savings, that is a really, really good choice, especially if this continues for a period of time that we don't know necessarily how long might last. If you're comfortable and you've got a solid emergency fund and you're really comfortable that the amount in there is going to take care of you and your family for the foreseeable future, maybe that's a 6 to 12 month period, the next layer of advice would be to pay off any high interest debt you have. This would be credit card debt that is, in the 18% range or so. Definitely, if you can get out from under some of those payments, that will give you some breathing room going forward. If you are in a position where you maybe don't have a lot of high interest debt, or some of your debt, regardless of the interest, has been paused so that you're not making payments right now, that's okay. Just kind of do the math to figure out if it makes sense to take care of some of that principal, or if it makes sense to hang on to the cash for your emergency fund, or to do something more interesting in it. And I want to point out, something more interesting is number 4 on this list. So we're really only talking about something more interesting if you've already covered numbers 1 through 3 on the list. But something more interesting could be a new piece of equipment for your business, maybe, or maybe it's an investment in a microphone so that you can conduct virtual meetings online, or maybe it's some sort of upgrade to your computer that enables you to continue working. Any number of things like that might make sense. It's also not a bad idea to think about putting some of it towards your retirement. As a self-employed individual, you have some great options when it comes to setting aside money for retirement in one of those SEP accounts, or a simple IRA, for example. Or you can think about just a regular IRA, and that's maybe not a terrible choice either. I get the question a lot if investing right now is a good choice. I think good is always relative. I think that question always comes down to, how much time do you have before you might need the money, right? And again, we should definitely be covering all your essential expenses and have a solid emergency fund before we're even thinking about investing. But if you've got some time before you need the money, if you're feeling relatively comfortable with respect to your overall volume of assets, and if your gut check says it's okay if you invest and then watch the market tank another 30% or so, if that's not going to keep you up at night, then maybe that's not a terrible option. Or if you're thinking you want to do something with the money and none of those feel really right, the food banks could really, really use some cash right now. They are being hit hard, as are most industries. And so as you're going through all this, if you have covered everything that you need to cover for yourself, then it's okay to kind of look outwards as well. But if you're not in a position to look outwards, that's okay. You can let the rest of us do some heavy lifting to support some of these organizations and give yourself permission to just relax a little bit. There are a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is the missed weeks since you applied for unemployment or your actual last day of work? Is the missed weeks since you applied for unemployment or your actual last day of work? I'm sorry, Karen. I think what you're asking is, well, I'm not totally sure. The missed weeks when it comes to unemployment. Maybe you're talking about one of the artists I was working with missed reapplying for unemployment, and that state required you to apply every single week and then reapply every single week. So he had gotten it and then neglected to apply again for the second week. So that was his situation. Some states have waived that requirement, so you do not have to reapply every week. But if you want to sort of plant the question in the chat box again, I'll try to do a better job answering it, or we can follow up offline too. The next question about unemployment, what day do I say my unemployment started? Is it the date of the first canceled show? First week I wasn't bringing in the amount to cover my payroll? As an artist, of course, it does ebb and flow, so it's not week to week. I would say probably either way is perfectly fine. I would err on the first week you weren't bringing in the amount to cover your payroll, but double check with your state to see what they qualify as unemployment. Because in some states, it's any reduction in income. In other states, it's a total reduction in income. So you might want to look to see what your state says and then choose your date according to what's true for your particular circumstance. And then how will online sales affect unemployment? If you make a $100 sale, but the profit wouldn't be all of that, right? Because you would have expenses. Do you report only profits, or do you report the whole sale as income? Again, it varies state by state, and most states aren't equipped to answer this question yet. However, I would only report the net amount as your income. So if you have a $100 sale, but $50 of that was expenses that you put into the piece and another $10 was shipping, you would have 100 minus 50 minus 10. So your net income would only be $40. So that's what I would report as income rather than the $100 amount. I hope that's helpful. Another unemployment PUA question. This is the pandemic unemployment assistance. This is that extra $600 a week in unemployment that was approved under the CARES Act. This person works 1 day a week at a store that's been closed since early March. You don't work there enough to qualify for unemployment, but you do think PUA will extend to that. Would you apply for that as well, or just for self-employment unemployment? Great question. I would apply for both, honestly. Again, kind of depends on your state and what guidance they have issued, if any, but I would go ahead and apply for both, especially since there's probably room for you to qualify for both. Because if your state is going to replace, say, half of your self-employment unemployment, that's great. And then the PUA could cover the additional unexpected unemployment you might have had. Oh, thanks for clarifying, Karen. If you apply for unemployment, is the retroactive date will be the day you applied or the actual last day of work? My last day of work was 3/10, but you applied on 4/5. Oh, and don't apologize. So it depends on your state. Most states have waived what they call the waiting period. So normally, if you become unemployed and it's not a global pandemic, you have to wait usually 1 or 2 weeks before you apply for unemployment. So if you live in a state that has waived that requirement, meaning there's no waiting period, and most states have, then your unemployment would kick in on, I guess, March 11th, which would be the day after your last day of work, as opposed to April 5th. So that means it would be retroactive to the day you were first eligible, which would be March 11th if your state waived that waiting period requirement. So I hope that helps. Okay, nice. Thank you for clarifying it. Okay, now we're getting into the questions that came in, and I wanted to start with this one because I appreciated this one. The question this person put in was, "How was my weekend?" And I wanted to say just thanks for asking. I really appreciate that, and then to share that my weekend was lovely, because weekends are often lovely and filled with family and dog walks and lots of good work that I am really, really lucky to be able to do. But something special I did this weekend was I recorded a whole bunch of webinars to be distributed in the Marion Correctional Institute in Ohio. Some of you may know I teach a financial wellness class at the Marion Correctional Institute. It's a men's prison in Ohio, just a little bit north of where I live. And so I teach a weekly financial wellness course there, which is amazing. It's just a really, really cool experience, and it's a cool thing to be able to teach financial wellness and budgeting and cash flow and taxes in that particular setting. And the questions are amazing, and the guys are super engaged, and it's a really fulfilling experience. It's all volunteer, and I've been doing it for a while, but it's really, really wonderful. So they have been under lockdown since early March. No one is allowed in, including families and visitors, and certainly financial wellness teachers. And the guys are having to stay in their cells or in their bunks 23 hours a day, just to kind of try to mitigate the spread of the coronavirus there. About 74% of their population has been tested positive for coronavirus. And it's a population that skews elderly to begin with. They have had no inmate deaths yet, although one really great correctional officer did pass away a couple weeks ago. So the community center I work with that offers all of this amazing programming is called Healing Broken Circles. And HBC came up with this idea where, since we couldn't teach classes and there's no Zoom option or online option in the prison, they thought we could maybe just record some lessons or some options and then put them on DVDs and send them to the prison, and then they could be played so that there could be some sort of entertainment for the guys as they hang out in their cells for 23 hours, because most of them can see a television from their cells. So I recorded a whole bunch of money webinars this weekend to be played at the Marion Correctional Institute, which might not sound particularly fun, but I have to say, it is really easy to feel totally helpless as we're going through this process, right? Because there is so much about this that is out of our control. But it also felt really good to be able to do one teeny tiny small thing to maintain some sense of normalcy among sort of all of the chaos. And so I've heard from many of you that you kind of feel that way too, that it's nice to be able to contribute or do what you can, even if it's not saving lives or doing something really that seems really meaningful. It's still something we can do that has meaning. So that's what I did this weekend. And I have to say, I think they turned out okay. The next question that came in, are artists eligible for the relief funds? Yes, they are. So we've talked through PPP. You'll want to look at your Schedule C from last year to see what your eligibility is. And then unemployment, of course, depends on your state, but there are a lot of really great options there. This question I loved. What funds are available to artists who only sell at art fairs? Depending on what your art fair schedule usually looks like, you would want to kind of do the math to figure out which option might be best for you. There's definitely PPP and definitely unemployment. And so depending on where you live and what your state benefits are, one or the other of these might be a better option for you. You can also think about virtual sales. It is not a perfect proxy for an art fair, but it is an option. And that Artist Relief Fund, artistrelief.org, is providing $5,000 emergency grants to those artists who are very much in dire need of support. That could be an option for this person as well. And any community foundation funding or city funding that is going to support individual artists could also be an option. I know the Greater Columbus Arts Council exceeded its goal of raising, I think, $150,000 to disperse to individual artists in the Greater Columbus area. And I know Austin and Indianapolis and a number of other cities have been taking similar actions. So what are some good ways to engage now in anticipation of doing our best work once COVID-19 ends? I really liked this question as well because it sort of captures the mindset that I think a lot of individuals, especially individual artists, are in, which is that, okay, this is bad, but we're getting some clarity, and at some point it's going to end, so what are we going to do now? So as you're thinking about things you can do now, you can always keep making work if you're feeling good about doing that. If you're not, that's fine too. But I think it's important to think about what makes sense to nurture the relationships you have with customers. These would primarily be existing customers, but maybe new customers as well. And then also think about what you can do to maintain or nurture some of those relationships you have with partners or vendors or suppliers or collaborators or even competitors. I have a couple more slides where I'll go a little bit more deeply into this, but I think maintaining the communications right now is really important. And I say that with a small grain of salt, because I think there are a lot of organizations who are maybe excessively reaching out right now. So make sure the communication is authentic to you. And so if you want it to be a salesy pitch, go nuts if that feels good for you. But what I'm seeing that tends to be more effective is pitches or communications that are more kind of checking in, here's what you're thinking, here's what you're feeling, those kind of emails that are kind of maintaining the relationship and maintaining that human connection, even virtually, just to kind of remain part of the conversation, if that makes sense. The other thing I'd remind you to do is when you're working in the arts, keep coming back to what it is you do that adds value to the world, right? And now's not a terrible time to spend some time kind of really figuring out what that is and getting really clear on that couple sentence summary of what that is. And then when you're really clear on that, I think it's easier to think about ways to continue doing that for those you serve, right? So if you're, the unique value proposition you have is that you are a storyteller through whatever medium you choose, it's easier to think about identifying groups that have a need for that particular skill set right now and think about framing conversations in those ways. Going back to this idea of those you serve and thinking about how it might make sense to reach out to them or engage with them during this time, I like this graphic of, it's basically the customer acquisition cycle. So if you've done workshops with me, you may have seen this repeatedly, but this is the idea of kind of following someone's journey while they're one of your customers, right? So someone might start being gently aware that you exist, right? And then they might move forward into a category where they're more than just aware you exist, they're actually interested in what you do, right? I sometimes describe this as like your mom's best friend who is aware that you exist and make work, right? Versus someone who's aware you exist and make work and is actually really interested, not because you're the best friend of her friend or the child of her best friend, but because they're actually really interested in your work. Then there's a subset of those individuals that are interested in what you do that are actually motivated to take action, whether that is subscribing to your newsletter or doing a virtual art fair or reaching out to inquire about a piece, any sort of proactive thing that indicates they're motivated. They're not just interested, they're actually willing to take sort of an additional step. That's a subset of the humans that are aware you exist. And then among those who are motivated to take that step to engage with you more deeply, there's an even smaller subset that actually take action. And this is where money changes hands, right? They give you money, you give them goods or services or time or creativity or whatever it happens to be, right? That's the exchange transaction that happens at that action point. And then after that happens, of course, we hope they're very satisfied and they would come back or recommend you to others or tweet about your work or share images, right? That's when they move into that sort of advocate category where they become your advocates. And again, that is a teeny tiny sliver of people who may buy your work or engage with you. And it's an even smaller sliver of people who are aware that you exist. So as you think about humans you encounter and where they might be on this sort of acquisition cycle, you can see how the messaging to each group might be a little bit different, right? So let's say you have kept track of all of your customers over the past year or so. So everyone who took action and then presumably was very satisfied. You could send out a communication to them, just kind of checking in, saying, how are you doing? I know it's a tough time. I hope you're staying healthy, right? Here's a picture of something I've been working on. Wow, isn't this an insane time, right? It can be just sort of a very gentle, nurturing the relationship kind of outreach effort. Or it could be a little bit further if you say, I'm having a virtual sale. I know you've enjoyed my work in the past. Maybe you'd like to come to my virtual studio open house this weekend or something like that, right? You know the messaging that feels right to you. But that's the kind of communication that might go to someone who already knows and loves you. I think there's a different type of communication that would go to people who are maybe aware and interested in you. And that might be a more sort of general global type of communication. And again, it has to be kind of authentic. But if you think about these are the individuals that you serve, and you think about who they might grow to include as this crisis continues and then eventually subsides, I think I would suggest that you craft your messaging around targeting these different groups. And the same is true kind of on the other side, right? So if you think about you are the artist and you serve these individuals, right? The communications to those you serve have a certain flavor. But there are also a whole lot of other people that help you do what you do for those you serve. So as you think about those that fall within your network, and those of you who have done this network map exercise with me are probably shaking your heads because the map is still there and it still exists, right? But the idea that you might have different individuals that fall within these different categories, all of these individuals are people or partners or collaborators or competitors that help you do what you do for those you serve. And I think it's interesting to think about maintaining relationships and communications with them as well. And it takes some work and it definitely takes some time, but now's not a bad time to be maintaining those relationships so that as things evolve this fall or next spring, or however they're going to evolve, you've maintained your connections during this time. The next question came from someone who's a young musician, and the question is very specifically, what can I do? I don't know this person very specifically, but I'm assuming that they might not have a whole lot of maybe students built up that they're giving lessons to, or maybe they don't necessarily have ongoing sources of, say, teaching income or, online performance income or something like that. So I would say start by reaching out. Think again about all of those individuals that are part of your professional network and reach out. See if anyone is doing virtual gigs that you can be a part of, or if someone is really overwhelmed because they need someone to help offload some of their students who have all migrated into an online capacity. reach out to those within your network and see if you can be helpful in any way. It's also possible that you will reach out and everyone will say, no, it's the worst possible time. I got nothing, right? That's okay too. And then you're at least maintaining the connection and feeling some support from others who are in a similar position. But I'd encourage you to reach out. It's probably not the best time to be launching your online studio lessons, right? If you didn't already have a group of students that were engaged. Unless maybe your best friend is a fourth grade teacher looking for additional ways to engage their students online, right? So you know your network best. Think about reaching out and seeing how you can continue sharing value with those within your network. A similar question came from someone else. Very generally, it was, what's happening with opera singers? I think we're seeing from a whole lot of performers across the performing spectrum that there's this domino effect happening, right? Organizations, theaters, opera companies, nobody's really sure what the next season will look like. Now tends to be the time when people are announcing what their next season will be, and no one's ready to make those announcements yet, because no one knows if there will be a next season or what it might look like, if it might be a virtual season, or maybe it'll be virtual in the fall and then live in the spring, or something else entirely. So do your own math as the individual and think about kind of what your fall and spring will look like if you have lots of performances or no performances or some sort of modified in the middle option. And for this person in particular, although this also probably applies to the musician on the previous slide, reach out to the groups that are supporting your industry specifically, whether it's Opera America, or maybe you're represented by a management company, or maybe you engage regularly with major opera companies. Definitely reach out to the groups that are very specifically supporting you and those within your creative world, because there are a lot of very specific guidance that's coming out targeted to musicians or singers or dancers or other types of artists. So I'd encourage you to kind of stay plugged in and stay connected. This was an interesting question that came through at the end of last week. This person said, if I'm developing and producing my own works online, can these be considered investing in property development for tax purposes? And I love the way this person thinks. And what's interesting about this question to me, and again, I don't know the context around it. So if the questioner wants to weigh in the chat or follow up via email to give me more information, by all means, please do that. But in general, if you're developing and producing your own works online, that feels like it would already be deductible to you as an ordinary and necessary business expense. I'm assuming you're not entering a new industry or anything like that. You're simply taking what you normally do and moving it online, and probably incurring maybe some even major expenses associated with that. Maybe you need to buy new equipment or have additional subscription services, or whatever the case may be. All of those things would be ordinary and necessary business expenses. So they would already be deductible to you on your Schedule C if you are a sole proprietor or a single member LLC. So if there's more nuance to the question, definitely feel free to let me know. But yes, absolutely. Everything you're investing in your business right now to stay afloat is definitely deductible as an ordinary and necessary business expense. Now, that doesn't mean you can use PPP money to pay for it, because remember, your PPP money can only fund average payroll or rent for your studio space or utilities, right? So if you are investing in new equipment or something like that, that wouldn't be covered by PPP. And so you'd want to make sure that you're not doing anything to jeopardize getting that PPP loan forgiven. But it sounds like you're probably not worried about that, and I'm not worried about that for you. This question, I think, is also very interesting. This person said, can I shift my for-profit business, and it's one that has not been profitable yet, into a not-for-profit? And the answer is yes, absolutely. You probably have to shut down the for-profit business and restart it as a not-for-profit. It's harder to kind of convert something to a not-for-profit. But yes, it's totally possible to do. But I'd encourage you to really take some time to, again, go back to what do I do? Who do I serve? What do I need? Those first kind of 3 business planning questions. And then think about what your real costs are. And then figure out how you're going to fund those costs. Now that sounds simple, but it's actually a really challenging exercise to go through those 5 questions and answer them well. But when you get to the question about how am I going to fund this, that can really nudge you toward a for-profit or a not-for-profit model, depending on whether you're relying on contributed sources, so money given freely in support of your work, or if you're relying on earned sources, so ticket sales or the sale of work or something like that. And as you really dig into the research, if you find that your business model is going to be very reliant on contributed sources of income, then a not-for-profit model probably makes sense for you. But I would really do some research and digging to make sure that that's going to make sense. And if you want to kind of maybe dip your toe in the water a little bit, you might want to investigate taking on a fiscal sponsor or partnering with a not-for-profit organization that could apply for some funding on your behalf. This would be funding that is only available to, say, 501c3 organizations. And if you partner with a fiscal sponsor, it enables you to continue to run the business in the way you have it, while also having access to some of that grant money. And then you can kind of see if some of your assumptions about revenue are playing out or not. So that would be my advice there. Definitely do the math, do some digging and some research into funding options that make sense for your business, and then think about trying it out with a fiscal sponsor before you shut down your operations and fully restart them as a not-for-profit. Time-wise, in terms of setting up a not-for-profit, usually you're looking at least 6 months, maybe closer to a year, and that's when the IRS isn't working remotely to process all sorts of things and trying to send out stimulus checks to most Americans. So you might be looking at even a longer time frame to go ahead and get that not-for-profit status. All the more reason to really make sure it makes sense. This question came in also midweek last week. How long should you keep your tax records? Thank you for asking this question. I love this one. You should keep your tax records basically for 7 years. That's the TLDR version of the answer. The slightly more nuanced answer is that you need to keep your tax records for the entire statute of limitations of your tax return. And so the normal statute of limitations is 3 years. And it starts from the later of the day you file your tax return or the day it's due, right? So if you were super on top of things and you filed your 2019 tax return in February of this year, your statute of limitations for 2019 still hasn't started yet. Because remember, the IRS extended the due date until July 15th. So that's when the statute of limitations for your 2019 tax return will start. And then it will last for 3 years. So we'd go to July 15th of 2021, 2022, 2023. But then we can have 3 more years added on to that if you have a gross misstatement on your tax return, which is an error of plus or minus 10%, right? So now we're looking at 3 more years, so 2024, 25, 26. So then if you add 6 years plus the year in which you actually had the expenses, 2019, that's how we get the 7-year time period to hold all of your tax records. One extra little caveat I do want to throw out. Let's pretend you were using your 2019 Schedule C to apply for a small business loan, right? Not the PPP, which is going to be forgiven or go away within a 2-year period if you're paying it off. But let's say you applied for a small business loan that maybe has a 10-year duration or a 10-year term. because you used your 2019 tax return to apply for that very long-term loan, you're going to want to hang on to that tax return until the loan is fully paid off, just in case that extends your statute of limitations. So that's the only little tweak I would add. But definitely 7 years is the general rule of thumb to hang on to everything, or forever if you want to add that information into your archives. But I haven't met anyone who wants to do that yet. This person submitted a question that said, navigating the unknown of what the next few months will look like. And this is something I'm hearing from a lot of individuals, but also a lot of organizations. And so my advice to you would be to embrace your inner Elsa. And I say this as a parent who has watched a whole lot of Frozen 2 lately. And that means that we are going into the unknown and we don't really know what the next few months or even the next few years will look like. So what many individuals and even more organizations are doing, they're planning under 4 different scenarios. One scenario is that everything's going to be fine by June. Now, nobody actually thinks this is going to happen, but it still brings comfort to some people to have kind of like a normal baseline budget as scenario 1. Everything's normal by June. And then people are projecting income and expenses just like they would do under a normal circumstances. At the other end of the spectrum is scenario 4, where we say, okay, nothing is ever going to be normal again. And again, I don't think this is totally likely, but I think it is certainly worth considering that we're going to have some pretty major changes that unfold as a result of this pandemic. So under scenario 4, you might be looking at maybe a year worth of no income, perhaps, depending on your market or your industry. Maybe you're looking at permanent online instruction if you are an adjunct instructor or if you are a music teacher who's teaching lessons online. Or maybe you're looking at something different where you recognize that those who purchase your work or engage with you, your customers and clients, may have changed their habits pretty dramatically as a result of this experience. And so their behaviors and those changes to the behaviors might impact you really long term. So as you think about what that might look like, that's a pretty extreme version of budgeting, but that's why it's scenario 4. And it's on the list because it probably makes sense to think about what your income and expenses will look like if there are some pretty permanent and major changes to your business model. Now, in the middle, between everything is totally fine and nothing is the same ever again, organizations tend to be planning out kind of 2 middle of the road scenarios. And depending on the organization, and for you, depending on the type of business you do, this could look a couple of different ways. One version of this is that the fall tends to be still pretty abbreviated. Maybe we still do a lot of virtual events. Maybe things are still pretty modified, but then by next spring or early summer, things get back to normal. That's kind of the scenario 2. Scenario 3 is basically planning for a year of abbreviated or tweaked or online or virtual normal, and then things going back to more in-person events after that. For some organizations, this means a modified performance calendar or schedule. Maybe it means changing in-person events to virtual events. It could mean any number of different things. And for you as an individual, this probably means looking at the events you typically have during the fall and the spring to see what might reasonably still happen and making plans in case they don't happen. And that's definitely something you should probably be modeling out and thinking about. But again, we're mapping these scenarios out and the income and expenses associated with each. We're mapping them out in pencil because none of us get to decide which scenario ends up being the most likely one. There are going to be governmental orders that continue shelter-in-place standards or guidelines that tell us which kind of businesses can open. And there are lots of other things that will unfold that will nudge us toward the scenario that ends up being the most accurate one. But as you think about planning when there's so much uncertainty, I would really encourage you to think about modeling out a couple of different scenarios just so you can be prepared for any variety of reality that unfolds. A follow-up question that's kind of related. Someone asked, how am I predicting the world after COVID? I'm not. I am definitely not predicting anything at all. What I do think, though, is that we will continue seeing the effects of this for a long period of time, particularly in some of the harder hit areas like the tourism industry, the restaurant industry, the entertainment industry, and even the arts nonprofit industry. I think we will continue to see funding sources a bit curtailed. And as we've talked about in previous weeks, I'd really encourage you to look at how you earn your income. And if your income comes primarily from individuals who have lost jobs, I think it's important that you're planning and recognizing that they might not be able to continue to provide income to you if they don't have any income. Similarly, if you rely on grants, particularly from governmental entities, and those grants are funded with tourism dollars, whether that is through some sort of bed tax or a hotel tax or some other tax that's collected at the city level and then used to support the arts, I think it's realistic that we might see several years before those dollars go back to where they may have been in 2019. So think about your own reality and do some math in those scenarios to understand what might make sense and what might be reasonable assumptions, knowing that pretty much anything can be reasonable right now. One thing I'm very comfortable predicting, though, although I don't like using the word predicting, is that the arts will continue to exist. They will continue to thrive. Individuals will continue making work that is impactful and speaking to people. And the arts will still exist because they have existed since the beginning of time. And a global pandemic isn't going to change that, although it probably will change how we engage with the arts for a period of time, certainly. And I'd encourage you to look at that as an opportunity to continue making work and continue reaching those you serve in a really impactful way. So those were our highlight main point questions for today. We talked about some relevant updates, especially when it comes to PPP funding and also those stimulus checks coming out. Stay tuned for unemployment updates, and also watch for updates coming out from Congress about whether additional funding for that PPP program might be approved. That might happen this week, and we might talk about it next week, or it could still be a little bit away. And then keep those questions coming. And again, if you have additional questions that didn't get covered, shoot them to me via email, and I'll be happy to put them in next week and also reply to you so that you can capture your information. It really is going to be okay. I know I say that every week, but we can keep supporting each other. And I, for one, am very grateful that you continue to hang out with me for these Monday afternoon chats because I really enjoy them and I love the opportunity to engage with each of you. So thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I will talk to you again next Monday. All right. Thanks so much. I appreciate all the messages, everyone. Jillian, I'll see you soon. Bye, Terry. Bye, Stephanie. And bye, Ellen. Thanks for joining. Talk to you again soon.